Theresa May is to return to Brussels to seek concessions from the EU as she tries to find a Brexit deal that's acceptable to MPs. Labour has dismissed her plans as Groundhog Day and tabled an amendment that would give Parliament control of the whole process. Opposition leaders in Zimbabwe say hundreds of people have been arrested in a government crackdown on dissent. A teenager has appeared in court charged with the murder of a 14-year-old boy in London. A chief constable who oversaw the sex abuse investigation into Sir Edward Heath has resigned after just 10 months in a new job. Also tonight, the Beefeaters prepare to go on strike, and Britain is getting a new classical music radio station. Theresa May has tried to break the parliamentary deadlock over Brexit by suggesting that she'll seek concessions from the EU on the Northern Ireland backstop, the insurance policy to keep open the border with the Irish Republic. In a common statement, she said she'd hold more talks about the backstop this week before returning to Brussels. Outlining her next steps after her withdrawal deal suffered a crushing defeat last week, the Prime Minister also said she was scrapping the application fee for EU citizens wanting to stay in the UK. Opposition parties said she'd offered nothing new to end the impasse. Here's our assistant political editor, Norman Smith.
There's so far no sign that Mrs May is about to abandon her Brexit deal. Instead, all the indications are the Prime Minister believes with further reassurances over the Northern Ireland backstop, she can win over the DUP and Tory Brexiteers. Some in Downing Street have also been encouraged by what they believe is a softening in the opposition of leading Brexiteers like Jacob Rees-Mogg. And so, in the Commons this afternoon, while there was little new in terms of the substance of her deal, Mrs May pledged to work with her backbench Brexit critics to devise fresh proposals to take to Brussels.
So I will be talking further this week to colleagues, including in the DUP, to consider how we might meet our obligations to the people of Northern Ireland and Ireland in a way that can command the greatest possible support in the House. And I will then take the conclusions of those discussions back to the EU.
In a further move to win over opinion, Mrs May held out the prospect that Parliament would have a greater say in the next stage of negotiations. And in a decision widely cheered, she announced the £65 fee for EU nationals to claim settled status to remain in the UK would be scrapped. But on the substance of her deal, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said it felt like Groundhog Day.
The government still appears not to have come to terms with the scale of the defeat in the House of Commons last week. The Prime Minister seems to be going through the motions of accepting the result, but in reality is in deep denial.
However, in a marked change from the normal barrage of hostile interventions, today Tory Brexiteers rallied to Mrs May, but with a familiar warning on the backstop. The former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on her decision to waive the registration fee for EU nationals? I think will be very welcome, and also on her determination now to go back to Brussels and fix the backstop, because I think that is the way forward. But can she confirm that in so doing she will now seek legally binding change?
Former Remainers questioned why the EU would now accept changes to the backstop which they'd previously resisted. The Tory MP Anna Soubry.
Last week it was a historic defeat. Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, this House has spoken. It has rejected overwhelmingly the Prime Minister's deal. And here we are with another week of can kicking. And the truth is, Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, the truth is, isn't it, nothing's changed.
It appears the Prime Minister has decided the only way to salvage her deal is to make it more palatable to her backbench Brexit critics and the DUP. Any final agreement, however, will now depend, it seems, on a significant climb down by the EU, something that so far there's been little sign of.
Tonight, Labour put forward an amendment to the Prime Minister's Brexit motion which would give MPs a vote on the available options to break the deadlock. The Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, said it would wrest control of the process away from the Prime Minister.
What Labour's amendment does, it allows Parliament to take back control make sure we have a debate on the whole range of options. Yes, we'll put forward our own option, which is a customs union with a say over trade deals, a close relationship with the single market and protection of employment, environment and consumer rights. And also, because we've said all options are on the table, enable Parliament to consider the option of a public vote as well.
The European Commission has said people shouldn't look to it for answers on how to clear the path for Britain to leave the EU, because now was the moment for London to speak. But there are some signs of possible movement. The Polish foreign minister has suggested limiting the Irish backstop to 5 years as a way of unblocking the negotiations. And the EU's chief Brexit negotiator said he was ready to work again on the separate political declaration about future ties with the UK. Our Europe editor Katja Adler reports.
A collective shake of the head is how you could sum up EU leaders' response to the Prime Minister's Brexit statement. Following the resounding defeat of her deal in Parliament last week, they told Theresa May the ball was in her court and not to come back to them until she'd found a solution the majority of MPs would support. But today, the Prime Minister announced she would be returning to Brussels to ask, once again, for changes to the backstop. But the EU has so far blocked any attempt to renegotiate the backstop. It was signed off by all 27 EU leaders and Theresa May in November, along with the rest of the Brexit withdrawal agreement. Instead, Brussels is suggesting new talks on the political declaration, a non-binding aspirational document on post-Brexit EU-UK relations. Michel Barnier is the EU's chief Brexit negotiator.
It's now for the UK leaders to build this stable and positive majority for a deal. So we are waiting for the next step from the UK government, but we are ready to work again on the political declaration.
The EU may be used to agreeing last-minute deals, but with only 9 weeks to go now, Europe's leaders are becoming increasingly nervous about a potential no-deal Brexit, which would be costly for them too. Today, Poland appeared to break ranks with other EU countries, suggesting a time limit to the Irish backstop, something the Prime Minister has previously pushed for. Jacek Czaputowicz is the Polish foreign minister.
I think it would be one of the solutions. So that's idea to be discussed, I think, within the European Union. I don't know if it's feasible, if Ireland is ready to put forward such a proposal, but it might unblock the negotiations.
But Ireland has already ruled out the possibility of a set time limit to the backstop, as have the EU's chief negotiators. And Poland, the biggest recipient of EU funds, will likely tread carefully here. The general consensus in Brussels is to wait and watch in case a plan for a softer Brexit emerges in Westminster.
The President of the European Council has described how he warned David Cameron that a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU was dangerous and stupid. Donald Tusk told a BBC documentary the former Prime Minister confided in him that he'd promised a public vote only because he expected the Liberal Democrats in coalition to veto it. In the event, the Conservatives won a parliamentary majority in 2015. Mr Tusk said he'd asked Mr Cameron why he'd decided to hold the public vote.
He told me that he felt really safe because he thought that there's no risk of referendum, because his coalition partner, the Liberals, would block this idea of referendum. But then, surprisingly, he won and there was no coalition partner. Paradoxically, David Cameron became the real victim of his own victory.
And the documentary Inside Europe, 10 Years of Turmoil, will be broadcast on BBC Two next Monday. The security forces in Zimbabwe have been accused of arresting opposition MPs and hundreds of their supporters in a politically motivated crackdown. The opposition movement for democratic change claims many people have been tortured in detention and that families have been attacked in their homes. The government has accused the MDC of using the recent rise in fuel prices as a pretext for violent protests. Human rights groups say 12 people were killed in recent demonstrations. Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding has sent this report from Harare.
Another funeral here in Zimbabwe. This for a young football player reportedly shot in the head by police. There is grief here, of course, but shock too. The brutal crackdown by the security forces took many here by surprise, and it's not over yet. This morning we found a young man in agony outside a clinic in Harare. He'd just been attacked at his home.
Soldiers and police.
What did they do to you?
They beating me.
With sticks?
Yeah, with sticks.
Why do you think they beat you?
Intimidation.
Intimidation? Zimbabwe's government continues to defend its actions.
The job of the government to make sure that the security...
This is the Information Minister, Monica Mutsvangwa, insisting that violent protesters are being dealt with appropriately.
...and bring peace to the peace-loving Zimbabweans.
But the opposition leader Nelson Chamisa said MPs, union leaders and activists are being arbitrarily detained by a government that has changed precious little since President Mugabe was pushed out.
We thought that by Mr. Mugabe exiting the stage, we're going to have a new dispensation, but it's not a new dispensation. If anything, the mask has been removed. The truth is that we still have the old system.
Today, Harare is calmer, business is open, but there's talk of more strike action here, and the economic crisis that triggered the protests is getting worse, not better.
A teenager who has appeared in court charged with the murder of a 14-year-old boy in East London. Jaden Moodie was attacked earlier this month while riding his moped. Daniela Relf reports.
Jaden Moodie was killed in East London on the 8th of January. He was knocked off his moped by a car and then stabbed several times in Leighton. Today, 18-year-old Ayub Majdalin appeared in court charged with his murder. He also faced a second charge of possessing a bladed weapon in a public place. He wasn't asked to enter a plea to either charge. From the dock, he confirmed his name and his date of birth as August 2000. He gave his address as Wembley in North London, and when asked for his nationality, he told the court he was British. Ayub Majdalin has been remanded in custody and is due to appear at the Old Bailey on Wednesday. The police say the murder investigation remains active. They've renewed their public appeal for more information on the teenager's death.
The Chief Constable of Cleveland Police, Mike Veale, has resigned after allegations about his conduct were referred to the police watchdog. Mr Veale, who'd been in the job just 10 months, previously led the Wiltshire force, where he oversaw a controversial inquiry into sexual abuse allegations against Sir Edward Heath. Our correspondent Tom Simons has more details.
Serious allegations against Mike Veale, who resigned on Friday, were made by two members of staff before Christmas. They relate to his personal behaviour during his time in charge of Cleveland Police. He was appointed almost a year ago. The force's Police and Crime Commissioner refused to give further details, but has referred the case to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, which is considering an investigation. The watchdog is now able to investigate officers who've stepped down following a change in the police conduct regulations. Previously, Mike Veale was Chief Constable of Wiltshire Police, where he was widely criticised for investigating sexual abuse allegations against the former Prime Minister, Sir Edward Heath, who died in 2005. Following that, an investigation found he'd misled his colleagues about how his police-issue mobile phone had become damaged. To avoid admitting he'd accidentally hit it with a golf club, he said it had been dropped in a car park and run over. Mr Veale said it had been a time of great stress in the wake of the Heath investigation.
Police say 4 men arrested in connection with Saturday night's car bombing in Londonderry have been released without charge. A 5th man remains in custody. Detectives believe the dissident Republican group, the New IRA, may have been behind the attack. There were 3 further security alerts in the city during the day. The European Union has imposed sanctions on 4 members of Russia's military intelligence service, including the 2 men believed to have poisoned a former spy and his daughter in Salisbury. Russia has said there's no evidence that the men carried out the chemical attack and has warned that it reserves the right to retaliate. Our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg reports.
This is the first time that the European Union has employed its new sanctions mechanism, put in place to punish the use of chemical weapons. The EU imposed sanctions against 5 Syrian men and against 4 members of the GRU, Russian military intelligence, the GRU's head and deputy head, and the 2 GRU officers accused of administering the Novichok that poisoned Sergei and Yulia Skripal. The men named will be subject to EU travel bans and asset freezes.
Они подозреваются безосновательно
In Moscow, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told me there were no grounds to suspect the Russians. We are yet to hear any evidence, he said. Speaking in Brussels, Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt said the sanctions were a good example of Britain and the EU working together in defence of values we all share. But today's announcement by the European Union is unlikely to spark remorse by Russia. At the upper house of the Russian parliament, head of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Konstantin Kosachov, slammed the sanctions as an irresponsible decision, which could poison relations between Russia and the EU for a long time to come.
A Chinese scientist who said he'd created the world's first gene-edited babies has been sacked by his university and is to face a police inquiry. Reports say a local investigation team concluded that He Jiankui had deliberately evaded oversight in pursuit of personal fame and profit. He said he'd altered the genes of twin girls born in November to prevent them from contracting HIV from their father. Reporting from Beijing, Stephen McDonnell.
He Jiankui has been found to have intentionally avoided surveillance and to have forged ethical review papers before producing the world's first gene-edited babies. Investigators from the Guangdong provincial government say that he also used technology of an uncertain safety level in order to carry out human embryo gene editing, which is officially banned in China. Last November, the Chinese scientist announced that his research had resulted in 2 pregnancies featuring human DNA altered to prevent HIV. One of these women has already given birth to twins.
The International Monetary Fund has forecast a fall in global economic growth in the coming year and has warned of increased uncertainty. The IMF is predicting growth of 3.5% this year, down from 3.7% in 2018. Earlier, China reported growth of 6.6% last year, its slowest economic expansion in nearly 30 years. That stoked concern about the knock-on effects globally. Our business editor Simon Jack reports from the annual World Economic Forum in Davos.
China's rapid economic growth, its expanding role in global trade, and the increased spending power of its consumers have helped create millions of jobs right around the world. It's become the world's second biggest economy, but in the last 10 years, its growth rate has swung from a high of 14% to less than half that now. The International Monetary Fund lowered its estimate for global growth today, and the chief economist Geeta Gopinath said any increase in trade tensions between China and the US could see them lowered further.
The risks remain, and it's going to depend a lot on what happens with the trade talks. That is ongoing at this point. In the event that there is an escalation in the trade conflict, then we would see a bigger revision.
This isn't just economic theory, it means UK jobs. Jaguar Land Rover said a slump of 50% in its sales in China was a major factor in its decision to cut 6,000 staff over the last 12 months. Today's news and the IMF's lowered forecasts sent a chill wind blowing through the Swiss village of Davos on the eve of the World Economic Forum. Many leaders, including US President Donald Trump and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping, have both decided to stay away. Business leaders and workers around the world will be hoping relations between these two economic superpowers get better, not worse, in 2019.
In the city, the 100 share index ended the day up 2 points at 6,971. The markets are closed in the United States for Martin Luther King Day. The pound was unchanged against the dollar at $1.29, and against the euro the pound was down 0.1 cents at €1.13.5. That makes a euro worth 88.1 pence. The agencies involved in managing and monitoring a young offenders facility in Kent have been accused of failing to keep the inmates safe. A serious case review was ordered after the BBC's Panorama programme broadcast undercover footage which appeared to show children at Medway Secure Training Centre being mistreated by staff. The private security company G4S ran the centre at the time, but the contract was terminated in 2016 and Medway is now managed by the Prison and Probation Service. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Danny Shaw.
By the time the Panorama programme was broadcast 3 years ago, the review says a culture had developed at Medway where the concerns of those detained aged 12 to 18 weren't taken seriously or acted upon. According to the report, the organisations involved in their welfare displayed a lack of professional curiosity about what was going on. In particular, it criticises the use of restraint techniques which cause pain, saying they increase the risk of abuse. One local authority, which had looked after children at Medway, described it as being in a degree of chaos. The report says the centre failed to keep young people safe. The chairman of the Medway Safeguarding Children Board, which published the findings, is John Drew.
It's the failure of the protective mechanisms that should have spotted that worried and worries me most. Because if we can't rely on the work of 14 different agencies and bodies, then we're in a very bad place.
The report reveals that the contract to operate Medway contained perverse incentives, with financial penalties for G4S if young offenders didn't attend education classes. In practice, it meant they sometimes missed healthcare appointments, including sessions about substance misuse. G4S says the lessons learned from what happened have been at the forefront of its management of Oak Hill in Milton Keynes, the only secure training centre that it still operates.
7 years after the first case of ash dieback was confirmed in the UK, the devastating tree disease is beginning to take hold in Devon. The county has hundreds of thousands of ash trees, and council officials say it could cost up to £70 million to remove the infected ones. Dozens of trees have already been felled. Gemma Woodman reports from Exminster.
Devon is a county defined by its leafy lanes, and lining the county's roads are an estimated 440,000 ash trees, all within falling distance of people and cars.
I want an imminent takedown on this one. Yep. All ash dieback.
On the front line of the crisis in Devon is Highways Tree Inspector Bob Stevenson.
So how dangerous is it then if you have a large ash tree that's infected on the side of the road?
Well, it could be very dangerous if it failed. It's got the capacity to kill people. So the larger the tree, the higher the risk.
Ash dieback is an airborne fungus, and there is no cure. It was first identified in the east of the UK and has been spreading westwards.
So we're looking for trees that lean towards the highway. We're looking for any significant defects, and they could include cracked and hanging branches, splits and cracks in the main stem of trees.
Ash is the UK's third most dominant tree species. Devon County Council is taking out trees where half the canopy or more has succumbed, but most of the ash trees affecting the roads are the responsibility of private landowners. The government is funding research into finding resistant trees, but results are likely to be some years away.
Beefeaters and other members of staff working for the historic Royal Palaces Group are due to walk out on strike in the morning. It's the first strike by the Beefeaters since 1963 and stems from a dispute over pensions. Catherine Stancheshin reports.
Some of the famous red and black coated Beefeaters will be joined by other workers on picket lines outside two historic venues, the Tower of London and Hampton Court Palace. Last month, GMB members working for historic royal palaces voted to take industrial action after the company decided to close its final salary pension scheme and replace it with a different one, affecting around 120 staff. A revised offer last week was described as unsatisfactory and rejected, with the union saying it will leave members significantly worse off. HRP says the change will be fairer for the entire workforce, and it's not expecting the strike to have any major impact on the day-to-day running of the sites.
Britain will get its first new classical music radio station for nearly 3 decades in March, when Bauer Media launches a station called Scala Radio. A leading BBC presenter has already been signed up for the launch. Here's our media editor, Amol Rajan.
In the latest sign that the market in UK radio is buzzing, a new station will be launched just 6 weeks from now. Bauer Media calculate that with only 2 UK stations dedicated to classical music, there is an opening. They hope to combine classical music with popular, family-friendly entertainment. Simon Mayo, a stalwart of the BBC who left his perch on Radio 2 after a difficult few months co-hosting with Joe Wiley, will present a new daily show from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m, 6 days a week. He will continue to host the 5 Live film review show with Mark Kermode.
For centuries, archaeologists have faced a common problem: how to piece together delicate artefacts without knowing for certain how they should look when complete. Now, a team of scientists has turned to technology for help. Richard Hamilton picks up the story.
Israeli researchers have developed a computer program that can create a digital image from photos of hundreds of fragments. It analyzes and matches the pieces using complex criteria, not just shape and color. The algorithm has been tested on ancient statues and Byzantine frescoes from Cyprus and assembled them perfectly. For example, it predicted how painted folds in clothes on the frescoes would continue into the next fragment. In 1845, William Mulcahy, a young Irishman who'd been on a week-long drinking spree, entered the British Museum and smashed a priceless Roman vase into more than 200 pieces. The director of the Council for British Archaeology, Mike Veale, says those who had the painstaking job of reconstructing it would have cried out for this new kind of technology.
There's a really good example in the British Museum of an amazing Roman glass vessel called the Portland vase, and it was in pieces. It's taken a lot of laborious labour to put it back together as a complete vessel. This software perhaps would have enabled that to happen much more quickly. Another interesting example, perhaps more recently, is the Staffordshire hoard, which was an amazing group of gold material, lots of fragments that were found by a metal detectorist in a field in Staffordshire. And a huge amount of effort's gone in, and painstaking work over months to reconstruct that into an incredible helmet. Whereas this software potentially could have scanned all those small fragments and made that reconstruction in a very rapid way.
Without the software, matching fragments is a bit like doing a giant jigsaw puzzle without the help of the picture on the cover of the box. Now archaeologists will have that complete image. Unlike the pieces of a jigsaw, ancient fragments are not clean and tidy, but dirty, broken and eroded. In short, a nightmare for all but the most fastidious and patient minds. Now that nightmare may be over.
Tennis. Serena Williams has knocked out the world number one, Simona Halep, at the Australian Open. Williams won in 3 sets to advance to the quarter-finals as she seeks a 24th Grand Slam title. Afterwards, she said it hadn't been easy.
Each day and each match and each game and each tournament, I'm learning something. And I think today I'm just learning that I have to fight for titles. I have to fight for matches. And I don't have any titles yet, but just fighting for matches is really important.
PE teachers are often credited with kick-starting the careers of sporting stars, but James Milner is probably not singing the praises of his old master. The Liverpool player was sent off against Crystal Palace by the referee Jon Moss, who was Milner's PE teacher at Westbrook Lane Primary School in Leeds. Here's our sports correspondent, Andy Swiss.
It is surely a Premier League first when James Milner clattered into an opponent at Anfield yesterday and received a red card for his troubles. The man brandishing it was no other than his old games teacher. The referee, Jon Moss, taught Milner PE at Westbrook Lane Primary School in Leeds around 20 years ago. He recalls his former pupil as a talented cricketer as well as a footballer, and a picture has emerged showing the pair in a school team photo. It features the young Milner, already the star player, grinning broadly. After receiving his marching orders 2 decades later, though, he may be rather less delighted.
Now I'll look at the front pages of the morning papers, and Theresa May's common statement is the lead for many of them. The Guardian says the Prime Minister exasperated MPs and business groups by offering scant evidence that she was willing to change course. The Eye says there was incredulity in the Commons as they heard Plan B become Plan A again. The Financial Times says Mrs May hopes her critics will eventually accept new concessions on the Irish backstop from Brussels and endorse her deal. The Times focuses on a warning by the Work and Pensions Secretary, Amber Rudd, that dozens of ministers are threatening to resign unless Conservative MPs are given a free vote on a plan to stop a no-deal Brexit. The Telegraph says Jeremy Corbyn has endorsed a plan to force another referendum after bowing to pressure from Labour Party members and MPs. The Mail leads on an appeal for the Home Secretary to order police to step up the hunt for the killer of 24-year-old Charlotte Brown, who died in a speedboat accident on the Thames in 2015. Jack Shepherd was convicted of her manslaughter and jailed in his absence, but is on the run. The Mail says Miss Brown's parents are to meet Sajid Javid to call for full resources and unflinching efforts to catch him. Finally, The Sun has news of what it calls a royal rumpus. According to the paper, a motorist has told police that a gamekeeper on a royal shoot at Sandringham hit him on the head with a stick and called him a peasant. The paper reports that Patrick Panks was left bleeding after a row over the pheasant shoot blocking the road. The headlines again. Theresa May has attempted to allay MPs' concerns about Brexit by indicating she'll seek concessions from the EU. Zimbabwe's government has been accused of carrying out a violent campaign of suppression following protests about rising fuel prices. A teenager has appeared in court charged with the murder of a 14-year-old boy in East London. A chief constable who led the sex abuse investigation into Sir Edward Heath has resigned just 10 months into a new job. BBC News.